Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Joseph, and I'm the Senior Director for Asia and Global Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of the NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation, From Crisis to Governance, Reclaiming the Philippines Democracy Narrative, featuring Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellow Tanya Hamada. Funded by the Congress, the Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellows Program hosts democracy activists, scholars, and journalists from around the world to conduct independent research and pursue projects. The program has hosted more than 260 fellows from over 90 countries since its founding in 2001. Joining this remarkable group is our speaker today, one of the leading voices on democracy and political reform in the Philippines. Almost 2 years since he swept into power with his election rallying cry of change, Rodrigo Duterte has indeed shaken up the political system. The administration continues to wage a controversial drug war amidst concerns of human rights violations, and the president's oft-expressed disdain for democratic institutions has been the source of conflicts with independent agencies trying to check his power. Observers are concerned that his authoritarian tendencies will continue to chip away at democracy and undo the gains since the people power revolution of 1986. In her presentation today, Tanya will speak from her 20 years of experience both in government and civil society on how the administration has been able to turn the values of people power on its head and the importance of reclaiming the democracy narrative. Tanya served most recently as executive director of the Institute for Leadership, Empowerment, and Democracy, or ILEAD, a Philippine think tank focused on public fiscal responsibility, devolution, and defending civic space. She is currently a member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy. Previously, Tanya served as Assistant Secretary for Monitoring and Evaluation in the Philippines Department of Budget and Management, where she helped set up a national evaluation policy, oversaw the grassroots planning and budgeting program and relations with civil society, and assisted in the Open Government Partnership and the Cabinet Cluster on Good Governance. We will now turn the floor over to Tanya, who will speak for approximately 30 minutes. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and continue the conversation by using the hashtag #NEDEvents, or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the Endowment at NE Democracy. If you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved in this event, and most especially your associate Kabud, who has offered vital assistance to the fellowship project and today's presentation. Thank you. Tanya?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for everybody who came today, for sharing their time. I think it's heartening to see the interest, both in those who confirmed and those who are here today. I think it's an indication that we should have more conversations about the Philippines in DC and about Philippine democracy. But let us first start with some acknowledgements and a disclaimer. Let me start this with saying that I am only the second. There has been only one other Reagan-Fascell Fellow from the Philippines. I mention this here because, first, in gratitude for the unique and amazing opportunity that this fellowship gives to democracy discussions, difficult democracy discussions and exchanges, but also to invite the groups that I see around the room to please encourage more Filipinos to take the opportunity. Having said that, I'd also want to issue a disclaimer that these are my opinions, and though it has benefited so much from the brain trust of these institutions, these are solely my own and not necessarily those of the institutions. Okay, so where do we start in terms of a situation for the Philippines? These are the normal, These are the normal top line data that you would get for the Philippines. For example, geographically and geopolitically, we are located in a very strategic location in Asia for trade, for maritime navigation, and for security concerns. Philippine democracy has been described as an electoral democracy, and the Freedom House scores put us at 67 over 100, with low scores of 3 out of 7 for both political and civil liberties. The country's economic growth has been steady for the past 6 years at around 6%. And the medium, GNI, income per capita, is about $3,580. So it makes us a low low middle income country. Also, civil society is robust, diverse, and deeply rooted. But it is also challenged now by looking at what are its new strategies and what are its new roles in the situations we find. Media is free, relatively, in the Philippines, and freedom of expression. But it is also challenged by the fact that it has a very weak self-regulation, and it is prone to what would I call sensationalism versus the more substantive coverage. And finally, our democratic institutions remain weak. I give this all because these are probably things that you already know, have read, have seen, but it actually puts us first on the same page of what country I'm talking about. Now we go to a more current situation. In the invite, the wording was strong. It says, Philippine democracy is in crisis. Why would I say this? Over the past week, at the beginning of the year, what were the headlines in the Philippines? First, the martial law has been extended for another year in Mindanao. On two reasons. First is for the rehabilitation of Marawi, a city that was devastated over a protracted conflict and armed encounters against extremists in the area. And secondly, because of the presence of those armed extremists in Mindanao. Charter change is now being pushed by a House resolution for a constituent assembly, which in the Philippine systems means it is the current Congress that will sit as a commission to amend the Constitution. And there is a motion that the House and the Senate, which are supposed to be separate houses of Congress, will vote as one. This is important to note because, of course, the 12 senators in the Senate, the 24 senators in the Senate who have a national mandate will now be equal to the congressmen who are more district elected. Also, there's an accelerated campaign for federalism. It is being touted as the only solution to poverty in the difficult situation that faces the Philippines. There's an impeachment case filed against the Supreme Court Chief Justice for issues that many analysts have actually characterized as internal processes and mechanisms that the court should be able to address on its own. The peace processes both with the Southern separatists and the communist movement are both stalled. For the communist movement, it goes from ceasefire to not ceasefire, not ceasefire to not ceasefire. Negotiations are suspended. For the Muslim separatists, the law that was supposed to be the result of a final peace agreement is in limbo. It has not been formally passed, addressed, or discussed by Congress. And finally, there is a narrative that's coming out now that says, enemies of the state. We're back to determining who is with us or who is against us in a very contentious arena in the Philippines. Add to this the fact that there are still 12,000 deaths resulting from a state-sanctioned anti-illegal drugs campaign that have to be addressed by the judicial system. Again, going back to my earlier point that there are weak accountability mechanisms in the Philippines. But this afternoon, as I give you the situationer, and I'm talking about narrative, and I'm talking about crisis and governance, that, as I enumerated it, I was coming from the lens of governance. Let's do a quick exercise and try to shift it. What if we shift the narrative and I say, Philippine democracy is in crisis because it is not responding to the needs of the Philippines. We need to extend martial law in Mindanao because otherwise the people will suffer the consequences of extremism, and Marawi will not be rehabilitated as fast as it should be. We need to change the charter because it is the reason why many of our systems are not working. And federalism is the only answer to poverty because of the intractable political patronage systems and dynasties that are in place. We need to impeach the Supreme Court justice because she has tainted the integrity of the Supreme Court. And for the peace processes, there is doubt of the sincerity of the actors that the government is engaged in. And finally, there is a need to strengthen the state because the enemies of the state are relentless and against us. As to the extrajudicial killings, we trust that the judicial system will deal with them with the rule of law. So you see that the narrative can be very different depending on who is giving it in the Philippines. And I think that is the challenge why, during this discussion that I will show you, is that it's very important to put some kind of framework to looking at how the narrative of the democracy in the Philippines can and should be looked at. There's a dangerous and false divide now in the Philippines of those being pro-Duterte or anti-Duterte. It has been reduced to, are you a yellow tard, as they call them, or a Dutertard? So this false and dangerous dichotomy simply does not allow us to delve into the deeper reasons of why Duterte came to power. And finally, there are labels of you are either a partner of change or you're the enemy of the state. See, these are very difficult and real divides that I will have to go back to. So essentially, what really is the Philippines democracy narrative? In some of the more reflective discussions of ILEAD, the think tank where I come from, our board has reminded us, try to listen to the Filipino people. What are they saying? The clamor against corruption, crime, poverty, joblessness, illegal drugs, Manila-centered governance, and elite capture of political and economic institutions is real. And it has not changed over the years in a boom and bust cycle of development in the Philippines. This is the democracy narrative, I think, that needs to be reclaimed, talked about, and fought for. It should not be hijacked, or owned by any particular agenda, because then it doesn't allow us to actually go and look for the solutions for these deeply entrenched problems. The Filipino does believe in social justice, equity, accountability, inclusivity, and the right to be part of all political and economic decisions. But let's go back to the first exercise that we did from crisis to governance. What exactly do we mean by saying moving from crisis to governance? First, the power of government is formidable, but it is not neutral, something you learn as a crossover. Power can be used to address inequity or worsen it. Governance is what provides checks and balances to this power through laws, strictures, policies, and processes. Crisis is what tries to exempt power from certain checks and balances. Now, having crossed over twice and back from civil society and government, I have seen that the contexts of crisis are defined and driven by the politics that are around the president. But what I believe singularly is that the president drives the decision whether one should move from crisis to governance or not. And I think this is the contentious part in which I look at the administration to say that at least for a year and a half or two, as Brian has said, into this administration, it seems like the narrative is and is going to continue to be crisis. It will not allow democratic institutions to thrive. It would rather consolidate power, centralize power, and give extraordinary powers to solve solutions that should be moved to governance. So if we look back historically, I will not attempt to give you a history of the Philippines from 1986 to the present. We can almost point out where decisions were made that moved from crisis to governance and where crisis overpowered any efforts for democratic governance. The extent of impact of each of these decisions really dependent on how fast or how effective was government able to move, to this democratic governance nodes. If we look at, so just a quick orientation on the diagram, it's noted by decades. So you have 86, 96, 2006, 2016, and 2026. But the highlights of the administrations are below so that you know which administration is covered by which of the arrows. And the push up is supposed to be the reform, the attempts to do reform, and the illiberal pushback, the push down, are the forces that try to stop those reforms. So let's go through each decade very quickly. For the first decade, looking at it, this was the 86 to 92 administration of Cory Aquino. A dictator had just been ousted, the Freedom Constitution had been enacted into law, and the basic infrastructure of democracy was being rebuilt in the Philippines. But what is personal and most relevant perhaps to my experience, my identity, and the work that I would be forthwith doing was that, to me at the time, the Constitution was a social justice constitution. I am an indigenous person from the north of the Philippines. So I can trace my genealogy to around 13 to 21 generations, depending, from 3 of the 5 ethnographic groups of northern Philippines. And in the Constitution, at the time, the most important fact for me was that it enshrined in language that the state recognizes and protects the rights of indigenous peoples to their cultural, ecological, political rights, but also their ownership of their ancestral domains and their ancestral lands. This was groundbreaking for that time. And for me, it signified that, yes, the strictures and the processes that will be put together by this Constitution will be something that the indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups in the Philippines will actually look forward to. There are the same language and coverage of this institution for agrarian reform, women, youth, labor. The vulnerable sectors of the Philippines were represented in that Constitution. So for me, the legacy of that period would be the enactment of the 1987 Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power to the next election. But during this time, there were 6 coup attempts against the current president. There were forces that what the Constitution couldn't remove were the deeply entrenched political dynasties and the elite capture of political and economic institutions in the Philippines. And therefore, on paper, as everybody from the Philippines normally says, on paper, we looked like a really, emerging democracy, but the fundamental structures to implement this democracy were not in place, and we were not able to kick out those forces. Some of the provisions would be enacted into law, and the next administration, that of Fidel Ramos, was one of the most proliferate in terms of enacting a lot of social reform agenda laws. Also important for the next administration, still continuing, was that the peace process emerged during this time. President Ramos was a minority president. He won on a vote of 24%. And therefore, one of the first things he did was constitute a National Unification Commission, which did really deep and wide consultations around the Philippines. And one of the most important results of those is that it identified 5 roots of the armed conflict in the Philippines. These were widespread, allow me to read it, widespread and deep poverty and inequity, poor governance, injustice and abuse by those in authority, human rights violations, corruption, and delays in the administration of justice. Number 4, structural inequities in the political system, including control by an elite minority, traditional politicians, and political dynasties, and enforcement of such control through private armies. And finally, number 5, exploitation and marginalization of indigenous cultural communities, including the lack of respect and recognition for ancestral domains and indigenous legal and political processes. This pioneer work would be the basis for what would be known as the 6 paths to peace in the Philippines, which has stayed for the whole 3 decades and counting as the framework of the Philippine peace process. It would be also during this period that I would first cross over. So I was in academe, a very academic field. I joined a Legal and Natural Resource Institute for Indigenous Peoples. And one of my first campaigns was to do a budget analysis of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to compare what was government spending on the protection and promotion of ancestral domains of indigenous peoples versus what was government spending for extractive industries like mining and timber forestry. So there, the dialogue and discourse between the state and communities or citizens happened during that time. But towards the end of this administration, as you can see, less, again, this is not empirical. This is really just illustrative. Do not ask me why the heights of each arrow are such. But just to illustrate that at the end, towards the end of the Ramos administration, there was the Asian financial crisis. There was El Nino, which is a climate change, event in the Philippines. And so these crises, again, weighed heavily on the momentum of a well-meaning administration to actually pursue the reforms. But also, good to note, is that, again, political dynasties, entrenchment of the elite in power, nothing changed. You know, it had already been almost, 12 years since the People Power Revolution. Nothing had changed. So the momentum slowed again for governance reforms. And then by 1998, as I said, it had been 12 years since the People Power Revolution. The frustration was palpable already in the Filipino people with the slow delivery of the dividends of democracy, of a very, very popular, globally celebrated event of people power. And in what would constitute, and what would follow, continue in subsequent elections, there became a blurring of the real and the real, the movie, the real and the real personalities of people who were perceived to be champions of the poor. And therefore we elected, on a very high mandate of 39% of the vote, Erap Estrada, a popular movie actor whose roles were always the defender of the poor. But 1998 to 2001 saw the effects, the continuing effects of the Asian financial crisis. The deficit grew in the Philippines, the debt grew of the Philippines, and because he was, how would I put this? And maybe again in the blurring of the real and the real, in an all-out war that he called against the Muslim separatists in Mindanao, he ordered the bombing of all the camps of the Muslim separatists. This was, diverging from the negotiations as the primary process for peace towards an all-out war. And in what was one of the most insensitive, and publicly called out moves of a president to celebrate the bombing of the biggest camp in Mindanao. He brought truckloads of lechon, which is roast pig, and beer to celebrate with the government troops, the bombing of a Muslim camp. By the second year of the administration, a corruption case had been filed against him over wetting money, or what we call the small town numbers game. And it resulted in Congress filing an impeachment case against him. But this impeachment case would not go to its, it wouldn't go to the conclusion because a 4-day people power event again happened in 2001, wherein the resignation for the president was called for. There are still controversies whether he actually resigned or not, but when he left Malacanang, which was the seat of power, the vice president took her oath. And therefore, we had a transition in power in 2001, and then Estrada was only able to fulfill 2.5 years of his presidency. Needless to say, there was no room for significant governance reforms during that time, given again this cloud of crisis that enveloped the country. So the vice president took her oath. That's the new administration, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. And it also saw, for the first time, the crossing into government of several of civil society leaders at cabinet-level positions. The difference this time was that, there were crossovers, in the first and second administration, but largely these were individual, technical experts. The difference in 2001 was that the group that crossed over as civil society were colleagues, veteran civil society leaders, and they formed themselves into almost like a cluster, a faction in government at cabinet level who had a governance reform agenda. This created more or less a real dialogue in cabinet as of the direction of reform. This was likewise when I first crossed over to government from civil society. And I was asked to join a presidential interagency task force to address the emergency situations of 25 indigenous peoples communities. It was called Task Force 63 because the mandate was so long, 25 in emergency communities, after the memorandum order that created it. So Task Force 63 was mandated to find practicable solutions to address land and resource conflict cases that were so complicated, volatile, or violent that it was practically life or death for these communities, that only presidential or cabinet-level directives were needed or could solve it. In each of these cases, the imperative of moving from crisis to governance was really felt, really urgent. The power of government for difficult reform, as well as the innovations for policy and program implementation, was also tested here. I wanted to give an example, but I can do that later in the question and answer. Just to say that one of the clearer and more painful, if not difficult, lessons of Task Force 63 was that within the strictures of laws, policies, negotiations, moving from crisis to governance takes time. It takes intestinal fortitude. It entails knowledge of the policies, the strictures, the openings in government laws, and the use of political capital. I probably regret that happened in the period of 2001 to 2004, because later you will see that not only does it need all of this innovation and political capital, but the president at that time did not have political capital. The popularity ratings of the president at the time were the lowest of any president going into a new term, and thus framed the nature of the arena of governance at that time. Again, we say the power of government is formidable, but it is more likely to be held in check by governance or abused in crisis. A military-led mutiny a year after her transition, the faltering economy, a crisis of low popular ratings, began to erode the administration's commitment to democracy reforms. And therefore, you could see a shift to favor decisions for survival at all cost. And this had very, very big implications on the ability of a group of reform-oriented cabinet secretaries to work within the strictures of governance. It was compounded when in 2004, she was allowed to run, because in the Philippines you have 1 term per president, 6 years, no re-election. But she came in as a vice president for her first term. She assumed the presidency because of the the people power transition. And so she was allowed to run, and therefore, if you count, she actually served for 9 years. She was the longest serving president. But it was a presidency of survival at all cost. At this time, I had also moved from the Presidential Task Force to the Office of the Presidential Advisor for the Peace Process, and I was Senior Technical Advisor to the Secretary. The shift from governance to crisis was very palpable. Memorandums for the president about strategic, decisions on the peace process took longer to return or get approved, for that matter. As support declined for reform and governance, 10 secretaries coming from that cluster of crossovers that I mentioned, plus some from the economic group, resigned from government in 2005 and called on the resignation of the president as well. I joined my secretary after she resigned. The president held on to power, and democratic institutions' check and balance and accountability continued to erode from 2004 to 2009. As the crisis of survival at all costs played out, the administration survived another military-led mutiny, an impeachment case, the linking of the first gentleman to alleged bribes by a Chinese broadband firm bidding for a government contract, political infighting, and a volatile economy. So in 2010, moving towards 2010, at the lowest level of her popularity, she pardoned Erap Estrada, who had been convicted at that time for plunder. So when he was ousted, after he was ousted, a case was filed against him for plunder, and he was convicted and he was imprisoned. But perhaps, going into the election of 2010, she decided to pardon the previous president. So enter almost 2010, about 10 months before 2010, something happened in the Philippines. The democracy icon of 1986, Cory Aquino, passed away. And the loss of the democracy icon was palpable. There was nationwide mourning. And this actually framed the elections and resulted in the election of her son as president in 2010, with 42% of the vote, still the highest in percentage since 1986. The elected president forged a social contract with the Filipino people and translated that platform into translated it into a platform that emphasized good governance. Now, the 10 cabinet secretaries who had resigned and put up an organization that worked on a platform for governance rejoined. 5 of them rejoined the administration, bringing in with them part of the governance platform that they had developed outside. I initially remained in civil society in InsightGov, that was the think tank at that time, to start to define the strategy of civil society engaging with government. Because the lessons of the first crossover experience was that you have to maintain your constituencies outside of government for the reforms that you need to do inside. Remember that in the Philippines, or for those of you who are not so familiar, in the Philippines, we have very weak political parties. So in a sense, civil society does, substitute at some point for some political power in terms of demanding from government. I would later rejoin government later on in 2014 for the Department of Budget and Management to work on citizen engagement in the national budget process, participatory budgeting, meaningful devolution of fiscal power, and on monitoring and evaluation for the bureaucracy. Now, from 2010 to 2016, good governance was the cross-cutting strategy of the administration, utilizing the national budget primarily as a strategic tool to introduce reforms in delivery of services, engagement with civil society, macroeconomic reforms and management, and relations between the national and the local governments. I could actually spend another entire presentation just talking about these fiscal reforms because that was the heart of my work during that time. But just to say that other reforms during this time included the signing of a final peace agreement with the Muslim separatists in Mindanao, a shift to K-12. This is a big shift in the educational system of the Philippines, massive investments in human development programs for health, education, and social protection, and the filing and winning of the arbitration case over the West Philippine Sea at the UN Tribunal. So all of this happened from 2010 to 2016. But there was no lack of crisis either during this time. There was the crisis and scandal over pork barrel funds that were being used not for the purposes that they had been awarded. There was the kidnapping of foreign tourists in Manila. There was the super typhoon Haiyan, which practically devastated central Visayas. But what felt different, if I would come from the perspective of where I was serving, was that there was more intent of the government to quickly move from crisis to governance during these crisis points. A brief example would be when Haiyan happened, the first thing that the government did was to ask support from, I think at the time it was the UNDP, for funds to put up a system. It's called empathy. It's a long term for, it's just a system that actually helps us track the expenses, how you get the investments for rehabilitation down. Compare that to the rehabilitation of Marawi, wherein the reaction is to declare martial law in order for the rehabilitation to continue. It's what I mean as an example of how it's different when you decide to move from crisis to governance. Finally, just to cap it all off, you will notice that the red arrows never went away. Meaning in all the reforms and pushes that we have tried to do over the years from 1986 in the Philippines to the present, we never really dismantled the pushback forces, the illiberal forces, that stranglehold on power and economy of the elite in the Philippines. And therefore, in 2016, the incumbent president won 39% of the vote in an immensely popular campaign against illegal drugs, crime, and Manila-centered government. Before we go back to where we started in this presentation, in terms of looking at really where's the narrative of Philippine democracy now, I mentioned earlier that if we look back historically, we can almost see where the crisis decisions have pushed government away from governance and into crisis mode. This is a net satisfaction rating of presidents since 1986. We have an independent survey institute in Manila called the SWS, Social Weather Station, who asked the question, please tell me how satisfied or dissatisfied are you in the performance of, in the name of the president, are you satisfied, somewhat satisfied, undecided, or very dissatisfied or dissatisfied? If you look at it, and if you look at the certain crisis points over the years, I'll just mention a few. You can see where the the political capital dipped. For example, for Cory Aquino, if I may point out, the first big dip happened during what we would call the Minjola massacre, when several farmers, mounted a a rally near the palace, and the tension and encounter between the government forces and the farmers resulted in the death of around 13 farmers. So that was the first dip. If you look at Ramos, this is interesting. This big dip around 1995 was when a Filipino overseas worker was executed in Singapore because she was accused of killing her fellow Filipino worker. The inability of the state to protect its citizens abroad, really made the dip happen. For Estrada, it was the corruption case. And now go back to what I said that, doing a task force for indigenous peoples in emergency situations is hard when your president has consistently low popularity ratings, even as she started her administration. So it's very hard to push, against entrenched interests when you know that you don't have the political capital. For President Aquino, this big dip here is when about 44 special action forces of the police died in an encounter in Mindanao when they tried to serve a warrant of arrest to one of the most wanted extremist terrorists globally. That pulled his rating down. But if you note, because, and I would attribute it, if you have a president who has a cross-cutting platform of good governance, the ratings stay relatively high compared to all of the different presidents. Now, Rodrigo Duterte is starting high, as all do. We do not know whether he will continue or not. But just to point out that the first dip in his popularity ratings happened when there was a killing of a teenager in one of the campaigns of the anti-illegal drug war, Kian de los Reyes. So this was the first dip of his survey ratings. So that's just to show that, yes, you can go back and you can actually see, more detailed analysis of this can be done. You can actually track different things to see that there is a difference when you try to move from crisis to governance, or if you stay in crisis. But some say this is very theoretical. It's not gut. So I tried to look, how much more gut can you go than hunger? So this is the same institution. It measures degree of hunger in households. If I may translate the question, which is in Tagalog, it says, in the past 3 months, has your family ever experienced hunger and having nothing to eat? Can you answer if it happened once, several times, occasionally, or always? So that's the question. And then the survey tracks it and maps it. What you will notice is that the increase in hunger during the time of Arroyo is steady. And even though it decreases during the time of Aquino, we're practically just back to where we started. So you lost an entire decade of trying to address a gut issue. And I would probably attribute it to because your focus was not governance, it was survival at all cost. So as I wind down, it is just to remind us that, yes, the power of government is formidable. Again, it is not neutral. Power can be used to address inequity or worsen it. Governance is what provides check and balance to power through strictures, laws, and policies, and crisis is what tries to exempt it for certain circumstances. Having crossed over it out twice, as I said a while ago, you can see that the politics around the president drives the crisis situation. But it is the president who singularly drives whether you will move from crisis to governance. And if this is the definition of power, in the Philippines, we acknowledge that power is still built or derived from patronage, vested interests, the dependency of those who are in poverty, an entrenched oligarchy, and conflict. As we've moved through the years, you've seen how different administrations have tried to grapple with it, but it remains that overarchingly, you don't win in the Philippines on the basis of, justice, equity, prosperity, or freedom. So if this is what power is in the Philippines, this is political power in 2016. Why is this picture very important? This is the wife of the ousted dictator. This is his son. So this is the wife of Marcos. This is the son of Marcos. This is General Enrile, who faked his attack to justify the declaration of martial law in 1972. This is the ousted president who was convicted of plunder. This is the unpopular president who pardoned the convicted plunderer. And this is the incumbent president. So if this is the picture of power in 2016, what is our conclusion about crisis and governance in terms of where the Philippine democratic narrative goes. Finally, I want to end by saying that this is precisely what we hope to continue to work on as I lead. I will go home this March, as I said a while ago, to a very divided country, falsely and dangerously divided by just being pro-Duterte or anti-Duterte, yellow-tard or Duterte-tard. But what we want to contribute to this discussion is that we need to look and reframe it as how can we keep moving from crisis to governance rather than stay in this narrative of crisis after crisis after crisis. And we want to look at the different areas where this can be applied. You can go to the website of iLead, iLead.ph. There's actually a paper there which defines this framework under one of the expert blogs by one of our fellows named Attorney Joey Mendoza. And he gives examples of how this is suggested for the West Philippine Sea issue, for the drug war, the war on drugs, and for federalism and charter change. My fellowship product here in NED is also a contribution to this in the sense that I wanted to really look at how to use the budget to move meaningful devolution down to the local governments. It's a continuation of what I was doing in the Department of Budget and Management to look at how do you use the budget as a political tool to empower the local governments as well as civil society. I end this on that, not really with recommendations, but actually reflections, and would most sincerely appreciate feedback and input from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. Is this on? Can you hear that? We have about 40 minutes for Q&A. Use my prerogative of the chair to ask you a question, which is, if you looked at even your statistics of poverty, hunger, performance, why was the Filipino population sort of hungering for a crisis government at this juncture? Why wasn't the success of the previous government and its commitment to good governance enough to convince your average Filipino voter that this was a trajectory to stay on? And I mean, what I understood a little bit was the crisis government provides an opportunity to demonstrate they're actually working on something, and governance is harder to perhaps sell as that you're working on it with a sense of urgency. But I'm just curious, like, what do you think led to the desire of the population for a very different type of leadership?
I think I would really say that it has been building. You know, the frustration with the promises of democracy, it's also not unique to the Philippines. But in the Philippines in particular, we still have very high poverty rates. And therefore, even as we've been able to lower the poverty throughout the past administration, at least the 6 years of the Aquino administration, 6 years is still 6 years. We have a 100 million population. We have a poverty incidence of around 20%. That's still high. And it's never really fast enough. Even for Haiyan, the typhoon, you know, no matter how many international groups declared that it was a fast rehabilitation process, the response was fast. It's never really fast enough if you're in the middle of the crisis, if you're the one whose house was destroyed. And so you add to this whole narrative and pounding discussion of democracy is failing, it's not fast enough, you need a strong man to get these things done, then the population is very vulnerable to that kind of a narrative. Right. So I think that greatly drove what happened in 2016.
Great. We have time for questions and answers. Please identify yourself and keep your question or comment relatively brief so that we can get to everybody in the room. I think the gentleman in the front here.
Eric, the U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance, we're based here. It's an advocacy group here in Washington, D.C. area. An excellent presentation, of the on the overall process of democracy and democracy. Excuse me. My concern is that the presentation, I think, misses my reaction. Is the cultural component the personality of leadership. I think that's a big determinant of political power. Because as you know, just to give you an example, I hear that President Trump is more popular than President Duterte in the Philippines. Correct me if I'm wrong, according to the surveys. Second to the Pope, of course. And going back to personality-driven decision-making, I think there were a lot of strategic mistakes by the so-called reformers. Could you comment on those critical mistakes which are basically driven by personality, like President Aquino having been there for 6 years, created many of those strategic mistakes, like the Fallen 44, the Philippine massacre, the Luneta massacre, the Chinese tourist, because of his personality, his mistakes in decision making?
For example, is if you have to depend on the personality of a president, that means that your processes and institutions are not working. Because precisely it is this tendency to rely on strongman versus weak governance because your institutions are not there. I think over the years, in the many scandals and crises that the Philippines has gone through, if it is a personality of the highest level, if you would recall, usually a commission is immediately created to investigate. An independent commission is always created to investigate the crisis. And then a report is given, and then whoever body is supposed to act on that report. You had the Agrava Commission, you had all of that throughout the years. I'm not quite sure that happened for the Mama Sapano incident. But I wouldn't want to equate it to personality, but more, again, what decisions do you make in an arena of crisis versus an arena of governance? Maybe the question to ask is that, what were the circumstances during that time that prompted a president to perhaps choose a crisis approach? If you look at it, Mama Sapano was leading up to an election year. That was right before 2016. So it was a crisis point. And so again, that's why I say it makes a difference, and the president makes that singular decision whether to move the crisis from that to governance. You compare that to, let's say, Haiyan. That was a big crisis right before midterm elections. But the decision at the time was to find the best way and the most governance-based way to address the rehabilitation and the reconstruction. So again, it's back to, do you have the institutions? Are you willing to strengthen those institutions such that when it happens again, you're ready for it? A side anecdote to that, I just heard that the system that was used in Haiyan, empathy, is what's going to be used again in Marawi. So again, it's have you strengthened your institution to deal with the crisis so that when it happens again, you don't have to rely on the personality of the president?
Chris?
Thank you for a terrific presentation, Tanya. You've used the word crisis as the counterpoint to governance, and thinking both within the Philippines context but also beyond it. One of the interpretations of the sort of governance we're seeing is that it's disruption aimed at reform. This is part of the narrative. See it in a host of places these days. And it skirts, I think, all of the very legitimate points you're making about durable and accountable democratic governance, in essence. I wonder if you could just say a few words about the sort of narrative, the sort of arguments, the sort of articulation of a counterpoint to the disruption towards reform argument, maybe a little bit different than your crisis framing, and how that would resonate with the sort of constituencies and audiences that today are very responsive to this idea of disruption or crisis, as you're calling it. Just curious for your thoughts on that and how it might be reframed.
Who crossed over into government, one of the terms we've developed is what we call opportunistic reform. It's when you have a crisis, but you also have the ability to see the innovation that's possible to institutionalize with that crisis. I think that is, you have a disruption, but then your decision is to use that disruption for reform. I think the key here is that in these narratives of disruption for reform all over the world, even including the Philippines, is what do you see or what should you see to say that it is actually addressing the reform and not keeping it in a narrative of crisis? Because, for example, again, sorry to keep using the example of the Philippines and the rehabilitation of Marawi, the declaration of martial law was precisely because you wanted to disrupt the conflict there, get the extremists out. But then instead of moving to rehab, using that disruption to actually put systems in place that could do rehab, you continue it into crisis of martial law again, extended, for that same purpose. So I think in narratives of using disruption for reform or change, we should become sharper in what we can call out as indicators to say that you are not moving or strengthening your democratic institutions, no matter how incremental, because I do know that strengthening institutions takes time, again, as I said, and institutional fortitude, but there are incremental signals that we should see from any regime, administration, president, to say that they are moving from crisis to governance.
Good. Question in the center back, please.
Hi, Paul Huang, reporter for the Epoch Times. This is more of a foreign policy question, but I'm sure there's a link to the question of governance. President Duterte is being noticeably more pro-China than the previous President Aquino. In fact, there was basically a 180-degree turnaround from President Aquino's policy, which were aimed at mostly pushing back against China's influences in South China Sea arbitration and defense build-up. But now President Duterte is basically agreeing with everything that China throw at the Philippines. And I wonder, and this has been harshly criticized by most Filipino defense and security experts that I read, at least the ones in English that I can read anyway. I wonder, is President Duterte's pro-China policy somehow linked to his idea of governance, that he preferred an authoritarian type of regime or ally with those regimes than with the United States? Thank you.
I don't think I would venture to guess what he is thinking. But what I'd go back to is that, again, the crisis, or at least the situation we're looking at, is that you have claims, to a certain body of water and the islands there by many countries in the ASEAN. What the previous administration did was take it to a higher court, wherein a decision should have been able to be used as a move from crisis to governance. Whether or not this decision will be utilized by the current administration, we still do not know. There has been yet no direct incident that would either ask China to react to that, the enforcement of that decision, or an assertion by the Philippines of that decision. So right now, honestly, based from governance and trying to figure out what are the strictures that would be involved in this kind of a discussion, we do not know. But I think it would be good to watch the next moves based on that frame. How do we move this, de-escalate the conflict, get it into a process that would address not only the Philippines' claims, but other Asian claims, and that of China, in a democratic way.
Across the aisle here.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks. Mike Brado, USAID. Good to see you again. I really appreciated your timeline and your own personal history of being part of this movement of civil society groups coming in and outside of government and sort of forming this participatory governance cluster. I'd be curious how you would rate the current administration on this. I know you're outside of government now, but given that the government is operating in crisis mode, is there space at all for looking further down into the administration, perhaps within the civil service, others, reform champions, to push a participatory governance agenda despite the atmospherics of crisis, and still push hard on these longer-term institutional reforms. Do you assess that there's still space for that to continue, knowing that your colleagues in DBM or DILG looking at progress still on things like open government partnership and some of the initiatives there? Is there still some room for optimism under this administration?
But more precisely, because D, I have a specific answer for you. In 2007, when we resigned from government, we were practically paria. Nobody from government funding agencies would talk to us. It was also about the time that we became a grantee of NED. That says a lot about the parias of the world. But USAID was one of those institutions that actually invested and helped Insight Gov craft what we called it's a very long name, Philippine Budget Monitoring Project Phase 1 and Phase 2. And it actually built the strategy of what would become the budget platform of the incoming president in 2010. So I would say that even when we're out of government, especially for those who have been in government, there is so much work to do to ensure that even when openings happen, there is possibility to push the reforms even further. As to working with government, another thing you learn when you're a crossover is that it's not a monolith. Government has so many levels, different agencies, national, local, regional. And there are reforms that move in spaces that allow it to move. But I think the important thing is that to keep the frame, long runway, short starts. So that if for example, that one of the trajectories of the previous administration was to really invest in meaningful devolution fiscally. And I'm sure USAID is familiar because it funded a lot of the DBM programs, that you were working with the auditors at the local government, you were working at the connections to the regional government, you were working with capacitating civil society to engage the government. These are still there. And I think within the spaces open by the Duterte administration, there still has to be investment there. But you also have to now invest in those who have crossed over back, whether in public fiscal management or otherwise, who have now, at least I would say, more luxury to think about these things. One thing you do learn in government is there's hardly enough time to think. There's hardly enough time to strategize and innovate because you're day to day dealing with running, addressing day-to-day of state. But when you're outside, then you get to reflect and you get to find the spaces and innovations that you want to work on.
Question in the front here.
Hi, I'm Marcelo Refur with Revstock Consortium, and I'm originally from Liberia, and I listened to you talking about the Philippines. I mean, it's very familiar, the boom and the bust. And that is of great concern to most of us. And I think you mentioned a lot of stuff. I mean, it's different. I mean, it's driven, these things are driven by lack of strong institutions. The established elite, which you mentioned, and, it also leads to the call for, strong men. People prefer sometimes to say you need strong leadership. And, but most of those things caused some of us before to doubt, the sustainability of, democracy in this country, because it is just like you have this large swings from, bust to, boom. But I watched the Liberian election recently, and I was pleasantly surprised about the involvement of people, both illiterate, poor, rich, with the social media, and it's kind of give me some encouragement that maybe as time goes on, as people get more involved with the social media, and it could moderate, this last swing we see from boom to bust. And do you have any of that in the Philippines? Is the social media beginning to play any role?
Philippines would be actually a sadder version of your story. A lot of the discourse of fear, of distrust of democracy, of impatience with receiving the dividends of democracy were hyped and blown to social media. In fact, one of our leading journalists, Maria Ressa, managed to map it. And she found that there, I don't have the exact number, let's just say 23 accounts that manage, a whole narrative of millions of people on Facebook. And these 23 accounts practically, move the discourse away from governance into crisis. And it pushes a perceived, it's like it hypes it up and then it makes it worse. It contributes to this whole idea of crisis. And so I think the social media as a tool, because I think social media in itself, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, is neutral, or so we thought. The way it's used to either, again, perpetuate crisis and or authoritarianism versus oppose it depends on the capacity of the users. And so in the Philippines, we do have a very, as I said, robust, active, diverse civil society. I think we have a very, very deep penetration of Facebook among the population. It's one of the most used platforms in the Philippines. But right now, from a reform perspective, we're losing the dialogue and discourse there. In fact, not recently, maybe last year, there was a comparison done among the reformers in the Philippines on the following and the trending of news on Twitter in the Philippines versus Facebook. And we found that it was better and more real on Twitter at that time. I don't know if I am updated. Then it was on Facebook. So, very short is just to say that yes, social media is a big, big thing in the Philippines. I think right now it is not exactly the tool we thought we could use for reform. But I agree with you that we do have to figure out how to take it back as a public space and use it for the narrative of going back to governance.
Good. I have two quick questions for you, or two questions, I should say. The first is, you mentioned that the Philippines has a very weak political party system, and suggested in some circumstances civil society has served as a surrogate or another vehicle for political parties. But I'm just curious if you can talk about, when you were thinking about the ability to continue good governance between administrations, how important is it, or how much of an impediment to change is it, that the political party system is itself weak and not able to generate the ideas and the individuals to staff the administrations to carry on some of these programs between administrations that aren't particularly partisan?
I think it has and always has been a goal of the reform movement in the Philippines to move towards strong political party system, or at least serious partisan debate, rather than personality debate. One of the challenges of civil society, even if it has taken on the role of being a subordinate or an alternative to political parties, is that you have many, and I mean many, if not majority, of civil society who will automatically shut down when you talk about political, not even partisan. So it's like, oh no, we're civil society, we're not supposed to be political. We are developmental. We give services. We partner with government. We don't want to deal with the distribution of power. One of our biggest questions when we were first trying to look at this is to ask the people's organizations we work with, how long have you been in the community? So they'd say, oh, I've been there for around 20 years. What have you done for the community? Oh, I've delivered this service and that service and this service and what's the biggest problem of your community? Oh, the elected officials do not deliver the services or stuff like that. What have you done to change this problem in the community so that you don't have to keep delivering the services that you say you're delivering? Oh, no, we're not political. We're not partisan. We don't want to get involved with the politics there. And so I think, if you ask me, yes, there are very weak political parties in the Philippines. Yes, it has to be one of our more ardent goals to work towards if we are to move past this boom and bust cycle. But I think one of the questions that we will also now have to ask, and I don't know if this is a question that happens in other countries, is that it's a redefinition of the political party system. In the Philippines, it's not just really civil society that has stepped up, but it's what we call now movements. You know, so the political partisan nature of a movement is clearer. It can be very partisan, it can be very on point, it can be very strategic, but it's a movement. It's not a party. It does not have continuity. But for the purposes of when and where it's needed, the movement actually carries this political partisan move. So again, the question is, whether civil society or political party, what is your relationship now to the tendency of citizens and reformers to move in movements rather than in structured parties or civil society?
Carl?
Hi, Tanya. Thanks. This is really, very, very interesting, raising a lot of issues. But one of the things that strikes me is the calmness of your presentation. In other words, the lack of alarm. 12,000 people have been killed, you pointed out, and, presumably that affects the rule of law in the Philippines. In other countries which are going through what we call democratic backsliding, like Poland or Hungary or Turkey or gone much further, but Venezuela, populist or authoritarian leaders come into power, and not only do they try to eliminate the possibility of opposition building an alternative. Changing the electoral laws, narrowing the checks and balances, and so forth. That's the main concern. And you really haven't talked about that. Does that lead me to believe that Duterte is a different kind of populist, that maybe he's not autocratic, he's a showman, but he's not behaving in an autocratic way where he's actually thinking to change the system? And what kind of an impact is his rule having on the capacity for the Philippines to return to a more stable and pluralist democratic process?
I think maybe more by personality. The presentation came out as very calm because I'm more comfortable in the arenas of the budget and looking at the strictures that govern these things. But this is not to take away anything from the deep, fear among reformers of what's happening in the Philippines. In fact, when I showed the slide on why Philippine democracy is in crisis, those are all, if you looked at them, they were all the institutions of check and balance. The Supreme Court, Congress, and maybe particularly the Supreme Court. I didn't mention it in my presentation. The reason why the impeachment of the Supreme Court Justice is Supreme Court Chief Justice is very important because on February this year, the Supreme Court is going to sit as an electoral tribunal to decide on the case that was filed by Bongbong Marcos, the son of the dictator, whether he won the election over the incumbent vice president or not. And so you can see where this is going if that is decided in his favor. He is one step away from the presidency. In fact, some of us even believe, and please do not quote me on this, although I know it's being recorded, that was the whole idea of the candidacy of Duterte, to put himself in a position wherein a vice president could assume the presidency, particularly that of Marcos. I also, and that's why I mentioned that one of the things that I personally took to be the most important legacy of the 1987 Constitution was the establishment of the independent commissions, one of which is the Commission on Human Rights. What would be interesting to all of you is that the current chairperson of that commission is the only other Reagan-Fascell fellow from the Philippines, Chito Gascon. But he's actually facing a lot of, harassment, trolling, personal insults over the work that he's doing. And so I think in the Philippines and for those who actually really see what's happening, it is very alarming. The only consolation that we take right now is to see that there are certain institutions that are trying to hold the line. You have some media, including Maria Ressa. You have the Commission on Human Rights. You have some people in government of interest recently is the security sector, wherein they have been able to sidestep every order of the president that would actually get them, out of their holding the democratic line. So, but we are particularly watching this first month, and that's why I flagged it to say that if Congress, so maybe this is for what to me would be the line in the sand, if Congress constitutes itself into a constituent assembly to amend the Constitution, all bets are off the table. I mean, that really clearly defines what the government is intending to do, for me. Previously, it was supposed to be whether they were going to file the impeachment case against the vice president. Again, but for some reason, these milestones were not met by the government, and therefore we're thinking that certain things are still holding them in place. For those of you who received the invite, if you've noticed, the wording at the time, when did we send the invite out? December, was particularly strong, and this presentation is less. Because if you look at it in December 2016, the president was saying he was going to call for a revolutionary government, so that he would, not have to declare martial law, because he would no longer have to answer to Congress. He would arrogate the powers unto himself. And there was even a date that was given. First, it was the end of November, then it was the end of December. But it did not come to pass, because they realized that if he declared revolutionary government, he would have turned his back on the Constitution. Therefore, he would have left his position, and the vice president could assume as president. So I think there are still certain, what would we call it, triggers that we are watching now and looking at in terms of what will happen very fast, or hold the line in terms of Philippine democracy. Lastly, maybe perhaps that's why the calmness is seen in the presentation, is because I am and I will keep trying to breach that false divide of being, you're either against the administration or you're not. Because I think the more important thing is if more people start to see it from a frame of, we all are against corruption. We all are against, centralized, authoritarian government. But if this incumbent president is doing the same mistakes as what we've seen other presidents do, we should learn from those experiences and outcomes to know that this is not what's going to answer the clamor of the Filipino people. And that's what I mean by we have to reclaim that narrative rather than fall into outright calling against this particular president without being able to say it's because it's not him. In fact, if you ask me, it's easier if he were to become irrelevant from the conversation. Because it allows people to see, what are we really debating about? Why did you vote for Duterte? Let's talk about that. Rather than, are you going to side with him or are you going to side with the opposition?
We have two questions in the back. Why don't we take them together so we can get them both in before the session's over, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll keep it quick. My name's Lisa Rappel. I work for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. You've alluded a few times to the work you've done during your fellowship term here on devolution and the use of the budget and empowering local governments. And I'm interested in hearing any sort of top level or considerations or findings from that and how we can follow that research and learn more about the work you're doing in that avenue. Thank you.
And there was one question. Did you have a question in the back? Yeah.
I'm Jay Tokol from the American Bar Rule of Law Initiative. I guess it's a comment and a question. I guess I'm wondering whether you talked about power and how the president yields power, and I wonder if there's any inclination or signs or indicators for power to be diffused or re-wielded to the people, and what civil society's movement has been in recent months towards building momentum towards shifting that power.
I'll do that quickly first before I go into meaningful devolution. There is a there is also how do you call it? A tiredness of civil society in the Philippines when it comes to mass mobilization. We've done it twice. And in fact, there was also another mobilization that happened of immense number in when was the pork scandal? The 1 million people in Luneta against the pork barrel. But I think, and if you ask me as civil society, it's actually in some ways a good development. We cannot keep changing our presidents through people power, much as we want to. It does not allow the processes, again, to strengthen the electoral reforms and ability to hold them accountable when they're in office. In fact, one of the things we wanted to say about 2010 was that it was people power through the ballot, a 42% electoral mandate for a president for change. So I think I will not comment on, again, I do not know what civil society is planning or doing, or if there's mobilization or if it should be done. But maybe you can keep your eyes and ears open, because we're approaching the anniversary of People Power again this month and in February. So there will definitely be discussion about should we organize? Is it the way to go? If not, then how? How do you at least either constructively engage and diffuse the power using the certain things we've learned from crossing over back and forth in government? Or if it is an option, then who and how and what? I hope I answered your question. For meaningful devolution, just very quickly, one of my portfolios, in fact, the main portfolio when I was in government, was to oversee the participatory budgeting project, or the BUB, as we called it, bottom-up budgeting. And another program, not as big, was what we called calzada, or infrastructure, roads on the local government. The pairing of these two was deliberate, because on one hand, calzada was a program that devolved money. So instead of going to the agencies, the money was given directly to the local governments, conditionally, meaning they had to improve their engineering staff, they had to have an internal auditor, they had to follow, the seals of good local governance of the government, they had to do, there were a lot of things that were involved. But the local governments responded, because primarily the whole intention was they didn't have to go through the normal agency and regional processes. They got the money directly, but they were now directly also accountable for that money. So when we talk about devolution, meaningful devolution, and what we're working on, and my fellowship product is particularly the same process, but knowing what I've learned from government, applying it not for infrastructure or bottom-up budgeting, but for livelihood. How do you incentivize local governments to improve the environment for enterprise, industry, tourism, economic growth, using the ability of government to direct downloads for local government? So if you want to follow that, it will be led by iLead when I go back, and it will be focused on livelihood and local government.
Great. Well, thank you, Tanya. That was a fascinating discussion. Please join me in thanking her for